Colonel asked his call sign. Then Ghost 11 stopped him cold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Colonel Marcus Hayes stepped out of his staff car. The smell of jet fuel and hot tarmac filled his nostrils, a scent that had become as familiar as coffee over his 23 years of service. Today was supposed to be routine, a standard inspection of the base's newest squadron, followed by paperwork and the usual administrative duties that came with his position. Colonel Hayes had seen it all during his career. He had commanded fighter squadrons, survived 2 combat deployments, and earned the respect of every pilot who had ever served under him. His chest bore the weight of numerous medals, each one representing a story of courage, sacrifice, or exceptional service. But nothing in his extensive military background had prepared him for what was about to unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. The 47th Fighter Squadron had just returned from a 6-month deployment overseas. These were seasoned pilots, men and women who had flown dangerous missions in hostile territory and returned home safely. Colonel Hayes took pride in knowing his people, remembering their names, their histories, and their individual quirks. It was what made him an effective commander, the personal touch that separated good leaders from great ones. As he walked toward the hangar, his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Johnson, hurried to match his stride while briefing him on the day's schedule. The inspection would begin with the maintenance crews, followed by individual meetings with each pilot to discuss their recent experiences and any concerns they might have. It was standard protocol, but Hayes believed these face-to-face conversations were crucial for maintaining morale and identifying potential problems before they became serious issues. The hangar buzzed with activity as ground crews performed routine maintenance on the F-16 Fighting Falcons. The sound of pneumatic tools, shouted instructions, and the occasional clang of metal on metal created a symphony that Hayes found oddly comforting. This was where real work happened, where the theoretical met the practical, where lives depended on attention to detail and unwavering professionalism. Hayes began his rounds, stopping to chat with crew chiefs about parts availability and maintenance schedules. He inspected aircraft logs, examined completed work orders, and asked the kinds of questions that showed he understood the complexities of keeping fighter jets mission-ready. The enlisted personnel appreciated his hands-on approach, and their respect for him was evident in their crisp responses and eager willingness to explain their work. After completing the maintenance inspection, Hayes moved on to the pilot briefing room. The squadron's 12 pilots had assembled, each one standing at attention as he entered. They were an impressive group, young, confident, and bearing the unmistakable bearing of those who had faced danger and emerged victorious. Their flight suits were crisp, their boots polished, and their eyes held the steady gaze of professional warriors. "At ease," Hayes commanded, and the pilots relaxed into parade rest. He had done this hundreds of times before, but he never tired of seeing the pride and professionalism that American military aviators embodied. These men and women represented the finest pilots in the world, and he felt honored to serve alongside them. Hayes began calling names from his roster, conducting brief individual interviews with each pilot. They discussed recent missions, equipment concerns, and personal matters that might affect their performance. The conversations were professional but friendly, reflecting the mutual respect between commander and subordinate. Each pilot had a story to tell about their deployment, experiences that ranged from routine patrols to complex combat missions that tested their skills and courage. Captain Sarah Mitchell spoke about a close call during a night bombing mission, where enemy anti-aircraft fire had come dangerously close to her aircraft. Major Thompson discussed the challenges of flying in extreme weather conditions and how the squadron had adapted their tactics to maintain operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Rodriguez shared his thoughts on the new navigation equipment and how it had improved their accuracy during precision strikes. As Hayes worked his way down the roster, he noticed something unusual. There was one name on his list that didn't match any of the pilots standing before him: call sign Ghost 11. The roster clearly showed 12 pilots assigned to the squadron, but he could only count 11 people in the room. He double-checked his paperwork, thinking perhaps there had been an administrative error, or that one pilot might be on leave or temporary duty elsewhere. The discrepancy bothered him more than it should have. Hayes prided himself on his attention to detail, and the idea that he might have overlooked something important gnawed at him. He had carefully reviewed the squadron roster before the inspection, and he was certain that all assigned personnel were supposed to be present. The missing pilot represented more than just a bureaucratic inconsistency. It suggested a gap in his knowledge that could have serious implications. Hayes decided to address the issue directly. He looked up from his clipboard and scanned the faces of the 11 pilots standing before him. They were all accounted for according to his mental roll call, but the paperwork insisted there should be one more. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift slightly, though he couldn't quite identify what had changed. It was subtle, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air pressure drops and animals sense danger. "I show 12 pilots assigned to this squadron," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of command. "But I only count 11 of you here. Can someone explain the discrepancy?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and he noticed some of the pilots exchanging glances. It wasn't the confused looks he would have expected if this were simply an administrative error. Instead, there was something else in their expressions, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps concern. Major Thompson, the squadron's second-in-command, stepped forward. He was a veteran pilot with over 15 years of service, someone Hayes had known and trusted for several years. Thompson's face carried an expression that Hayes had rarely seen before, uncertainty mixed with what appeared to be reluctance to speak. "Sir," Thompson began slowly, "about Ghost 11. His voice trailed off, and Hayes noticed that the other pilots had become noticeably more attentive. Whatever Thompson was about to say, it was clearly significant to everyone in the room. The casual atmosphere of the inspection had been replaced by something more serious, more charged with meaning. Hayes waited for Thompson to continue, but the major seemed to be struggling with how to proceed. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the distant sounds of aircraft maintenance continuing in the hangar beyond. Hayes had been in enough tense situations to recognize when something important was about to be revealed, and his instincts told him that whatever he was about to learn would change everything. Colonel asked his call sign, then Ghost 11 stopped him cold, Part 2. The tension in the briefing room had become almost tangible. Colonel Hayes watched Major Thompson's face carefully, noting the way the seasoned pilot's jaw worked silently, as if he were choosing his words with extraordinary care. In Hayes's experience, when combat veterans hesitated to speak, the story they were holding back was usually one worth hearing. "Major Thompson," Hayes said firmly, "I need you to explain what's happening here. Who is Ghost 11, and where is he?" The colonel's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command, the kind that had compelled subordinates to provide straight answers for over 2 decades. But Thompson's response wasn't what Hayes expected. "Sir," Thompson said quietly, "Ghost 11 was Captain David Chen. He was our best pilot." The past tense hung heavy in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Hayes felt his stomach tighten as the implications began to register. In military aviation, when someone spoke about a pilot in the past tense, it usually meant only one thing. "Was?" Hayes repeated, his voice softer now but no less intense. "Major, I need the full story. What happened to Captain Chen?" Around the room, the other pilots had grown completely still. Their breathing seemed to have become synchronized, shallow and careful, as if they were all holding their breath for what came next. Thompson looked around at his fellow pilots, seeming to draw strength from their collective presence. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of something that Hayes couldn't quite identify. Grief, certainly, but also something else. something that sounded almost like awe. "Captain Chen was killed in action 6 weeks ago, sir," Thompson began. "We were conducting a deep strike mission against a high-value target when his aircraft was hit by enemy fire. The mission was classified at the highest levels, and the details are still being processed through intelligence channels." Hayes nodded grimly, understanding the implications. Classified missions often took weeks or even months for the paperwork to filter through the system. But Thompson wasn't finished. "The thing is, sir, Captain Chen saved all of our lives that day. When his F-16 took damage, he could have ejected safely. He was over friendly territory, and his chances of survival would have been excellent. Instead, he stayed with his aircraft and used it to take out an enemy surface-to-air missile site that had our entire formation locked up." The room remained silent, except for the distant sounds of the airfield. Hayes processed this information, understanding the heroism involved, but still puzzled by the strange atmosphere in the room. Pilots died in combat. It was a tragic but accepted reality of military aviation. While Captain Chen's sacrifice was certainly worthy of recognition and respect, it didn't explain the unusual behavior he was witnessing. "That's a heroic action," Hayes said carefully. "Captain Chen will be recommended for appropriate recognition, but I still don't understand why his name is on my roster if he was killed 6 weeks ago. Administrative delays don't typically last that long." He looked around the room, noting that several pilots were now staring at the floor or out the windows, avoiding his gaze. Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of the younger pilots, shifted uncomfortably before speaking up. "Sir, with respect, there's more to the story." His voice was barely above a whisper, and Hayes had to lean forward slightly to hear him clearly. "Captain Chen, after his aircraft was destroyed, we all confirmed he didn't eject. We saw the impact. There was no way anyone could have survived." "But?" Hayes prompted, sensing there was indeed more to come. Rodriguez glanced nervously at Thompson, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "But, sir, 30 minutes later, when we were heading home, Ghost 11 came back on the radio." The young lieutenant's words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room, and Hayes felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm morning air. "That's impossible," Hayes said flatly. "You just told me his aircraft was destroyed and he didn't eject. Radio equipment doesn't survive that kind of impact." He was trying to apply logic to what sounded like an impossible situation, but the expressions on the pilots' faces suggested they weren't joking or mistaken. Major Thompson took over the narrative again. "That's what we thought too, sir. But the voice on the radio was definitely Captain Chen. We all recognized it. His accent, his speech patterns, the way he used certain phrases. More importantly, he gave us information that saved our lives." Hayes felt his rational mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "What kind of information?" "There was an enemy fighter patrol that had been vectored to intercept us on our return route," Thompson explained. "None of us had detected them on our radar. They were using some kind of stealth technology or electronic countermeasures that made them invisible to our systems. But Ghost 11 warned us about their exact position and altitude. He told us to change course immediately and climb to a specific altitude." Captain Mitchell, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "I was flying lead that day, sir. When Ghost 11's warning came through, my first instinct was to ignore it. I thought maybe I was hearing things, or that it was some kind of enemy deception. But something about the voice. It was unmistakably Chen, and he sounded urgent." "So you followed the instructions?" Hayes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Mitchell confirmed. "We changed course and climbed exactly as instructed. 3 minutes later, 4 enemy fighters passed directly through the airspace where we would have been if we had maintained our original route. They never saw us, and we made it home safely." The story was becoming more surreal by the minute, but Hayes could see that these pilots, seasoned professionals who had faced real combat, absolutely believed every word they were saying. Their sincerity was unquestionable, but the implications of their account challenged everything Hayes thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death. "Did anyone else hear this radio transmission?" Hayes asked, grasping for some kind of rational explanation. "Air traffic control? Other aircraft? Any kind of recording?" Thompson shook his head slowly. "That's the strange part, sir. When we got back to base and were debriefed, we all mentioned the warning from Ghost 11. But when intelligence reviewed the RAD IO logs and recordings, there was no trace of any transmission from Captain Chen's call sign. According to the official record, his last communication was when he reported taking damage and beginning his attack run on the missile site." Hayes ran a hand through his graying hair, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "So you're telling me that 11 experienced pilots all heard the same impossible radio transmission, but there's no official record of it ever happening?" The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming, but he couldn't dismiss the testimony of so many credible witnesses. "That's correct, sir," Thompson replied. "But there's something else. Something that happened during our flight home that made us all believers." The Major paused, as if gathering courage for what he was about to reveal. "Ghost 11 didn't just warn us about the enemy fighters, he stayed with us all the way back to base. Colonel asked his call sign, then Ghost 11 stopped him cold, Part 3. Colonel Hayes stared at Major Thompson, his mind racing to process the impossible story unfolding before him. In all his years of military service, he had heard tales of combat that stretched credibility, but this was beyond anything in his experience. Yet the conviction in these pilots' voices was undeniable, and their collective testimony carried the weight of shared truth. "He stayed with you?" Hayes repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Major, I need you to be very specific about what you mean by that." Thompson nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was about to describe. "Sir, for the entire 40-minute flight back to base, Ghost 11 maintained radio contact with our formation. He provided navigation corrections when we drifted off course due to headwinds. He warned us about weather patterns ahead that weren't showing up on our instruments. Most importantly, he maintained his position as our wingman." Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of reality. "His position? Are you saying you could see him?" Captain Martinez, who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Sir, I was flying tail-end Charlie that day, responsible for watching our six and maintaining formation integrity. Throughout the entire flight home, I could see Ghost 11's aircraft in my peripheral vision. It was there, the familiar outline of an F-16, maintaining proper spacing and altitude." "But you said his aircraft was destroyed," Hayes protested, grasping for rational explanations that seemed to slip away like smoke. "It was, sir," Martinez confirmed. "We all saw the impact, the explosion, the debris field, but somehow impossibly there he was, flying formation with us like nothing had happened. Every time I tried to look directly at his aircraft, it seemed to fade slightly, like looking at something through heat shimmer. But in my peripheral vision, it was solid and real." Lieutenant Rodriguez added his own testimony. "Sir, I tried to photograph the formation during our return flight. I wanted to capture what I knew would be our last mission together. But when I reviewed the images later, there were only 11 aircraft visible. The space where Ghost 11 should have been was empty, but during the flight, I swear I could see him there." Hayes walked to the window overlooking the flight line, staring out at the rows of F-16s parked in perfect formation. The morning sun reflected off their canopies, creating brilliant flashes of light that reminded him uncomfortably of the angel wings some pilots claim to see during near-death experiences. He had always been a practical man, someone who dealt in facts and evidence, but the testimony of 11 experienced pilots was itself a form of evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. "Has anything like this happened since that mission?" Hayes asked, turning back to face the assembled pilots. Major Thompson exchanged glances with several of his colleagues before answering. Sir, that's why we're all here together today. Yesterday, during a routine training flight, it happened again. The colonel felt his breath catch in his throat as Thompson continued. We were practicing tactical formations when Ghost 11's voice came over the radio. He warned us about a civilian aircraft that had strayed into our training area, an aircraft that wasn't showing up on anyone's radar. Captain Phillips, who hadn't spoken before, added, I was the safety observer for that exercise. Sir, when Ghost 11's warning came through, I immediately contacted air traffic control to verify if there were any civilian aircraft in our training area. Initially, they said no, but then, 30 seconds later, they called back in a panic. A small private plane had suffered a radio failure and was flying directly through our training zone. We avoided a potential disaster because of Ghost 11's warning, Thompson continued. If we had continued our exercise as planned, there could have been a catastrophic collision. The civilian pilot never knew how close he came to death. Hayes absorbed this information, struggling with implications that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of existence itself. And you're certain it was Captain Chen's voice again? Absolutely certain. Sir, came the unanimous response from multiple pilots simultaneously. The colonel walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did at this moment. He was faced with a decision that would affect not only his career but potentially his understanding of reality itself. How did one process reports of supernatural events from reliable, combat-tested military personnel? Gentlemen and lady, Hayes said finally, addressing the entire group. What you're describing falls well outside normal military protocols. If I were to include these events in my official report, it would likely result in psychological evaluations for everyone involved and potentially end several careers. The pilots nodded grimly, understanding the implications. They had clearly wrestled with this dilemma themselves. However, Hayes continued, I've known most of you for years. Your service records are exemplary, your psychological profiles are solid, and your credibility is beyond question. I'm not going to dismiss what you've experienced simply because it doesn't fit within conventional understanding. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Major Thompson, I want you to establish a special protocol for the squadron. If Ghost 11 makes contact again, I want detailed documentation of everything. Time, weather conditions, exact communications, and any actions taken based on his information. This documentation will be classified and kept separate from normal operational reports. Thompson nodded, understanding. Yes, sir. What should we call this protocol? Hayes thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. Call it the Guardian Angel Protocol. And Major, make sure that Captain Chen's name remains on the squadron roster. Apparently, he's still serving with distinction. As the briefing concluded and the pilots filed out, Hayes remained seated, contemplating the impossible story he had just heard. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, reminding him about their dinner plans. The ordinary world was calling him back, but he knew he would never look at his squadron or at the mysteries of life and death in quite the same way again. That evening, as Colonel Hayes drove home through the gathering twilight, he found himself scanning the sky above the airfield. For just a moment, he thought he saw a single contrail cutting across the darkening sky, glowing faintly in the last rays of the setting sun. It could have been a commercial airliner or a routine military flight, but somehow, he knew it wasn't. Ghost 11 was still on patrol, still protecting his squadron, still serving with honor even beyond the boundaries of life itself. And Colonel Hayes, a practical military man who had always dealt in facts and reality, found himself hoping that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some guardians were meant to remain on duty, and some bonds forged in combat were stronger than death itself.